So imagine surviving just an unimaginable trauma. You have just watched your teacher, your leader, your closest friend, endure a brutal public execution.
Yeah, just horrific.
You saw the life leave his body, you watched the burial, and the grief is just suffocating.
Oh, for sure.
Then, 3 days later, you walk into a garden in the early morning light, and through the haze of your own tears, you realize the person standing in front of you is not the gardener. It is him.
He is alive.
He is alive, and your immediate, undeniable human instinct is to run forward, throw your arms around him, and never let go.
Yeah, I mean, it is the most visceral reaction in the world.
You reach out, and then he puts up a hand and says, "Do not touch me."
It is just the most baffling, counterintuitive moment in the entire New Testament.
It really is.
If you are reading the text simply as a narrative of a reunion, it feels almost cruel. It completely shatters the expected human script.
And that is the encounter between Jesus and Mary Magdalene outside the empty tomb, on the morning of the resurrection. She recognizes him, she approaches, and he issues this incredibly cryptic command.
Do not hold on to me.
And that specific jarring command is our entire mission for this deep dive today.
We are placing a magnifying glass over those specific words because they represent the ultimate exegetical puzzle. The moment you read them, you are forced to stop and ask what is actually happening in the space between these two figures. To truly understand the weight of this command, we must look to how it was understood by the foundational thinkers of the Christian church. We have to look at the text through their eyes.
And that is what is so exciting. We get to look over the shoulders of history's greatest theological minds to see how they cracked this specific puzzle.
We have an incredible stack of sources today.
We really do. We're pulling from the ancient homilies, sermons, and dogmatic treatises of the Church Fathers. So we have St. Augustine, St. John Chrysostom, St. Gregory of Nyssa, and Pope St. Leo the Great.
A powerhouse lineup.
Yeah. And then to bring this historical analysis firmly into our modern era, we are examining the theological work of Pope Benedict XVI, Joseph Ratzinger, from his book Jesus of Nazareth.
So the parameters are strictly textual and historical. What did these specific writers actually document about the meaning of these words?
Because by relying on their rigorous analysis, we avoid the pitfalls of subjective interpretation. We enter into a profound, objective dialogue about the nature of God that has spanned centuries.
So let's start with the apparent contradiction, because that is the foundational problem that every single one of these writers immediately recognized. They did not gloss over it.
No, they hit it head on.
They did. Jesus tells Mary, "Touch me not, for I am not yet ascended to my Father."
But if you keep reading the resurrection accounts in the Gospels, that rule seems to be broken almost immediately.
Yes, St. Augustine points this out with laser focus. Just a short time later, Jesus appears in the upper room and explicitly invites the disciple Thomas to handle his physical wounds.
He says, "Reach hither thy finger, and behold my hands, and put forth thy hand, and thrust it into my side."
The contrast is stark. You have Jesus forbidding Mary to even hold him, and then actively commanding Thomas to thrust his hand into a spear wound.
It makes you do a double take.
It does. Furthermore, the Gospel of Matthew explicitly records that other women, upon encountering the risen Jesus before the ascension, approached him, held him by the feet, and worshipped him.
And Jesus did not stop them. He offered them a greeting.
Yeah. So the reader is presented with a jarring inconsistency if they attempt to read the command to Mary in a purely literal, physical sense.
This is what creates the friction,
Yeah.
Why wouldn't Jesus just allow the first witness of his resurrection the same physical comfort he allowed the others?
That is the question.
Because if physical touch was inherently problematic before the ascension, perhaps because his glorified body was somehow fragile or off limits, then why invite Thomas to aggressively probe a wound?
And why let the other women hold his feet?
Yeah. On the surface, it feels like a bizarre double standard.
But that friction is exactly what forced the Church Fathers to look past a literal surface-level reading of the text.
They knew something else was going on.
Because if the prohibition was merely about the physics of a resurrected body, then the timeline and the rules are fundamentally inconsistent. But these early theologians operated on an unwavering principle.
Which was?
That the scriptures possess a profound, flawless internal coherence. If a literal reading yields an impossible contradiction, the text is demanding that you dig deeper.
So as Augustine notes when looking at this passage, some sacred mystery must lie concealed in these words.
A sacred mystery. That means the word touch in this specific garden encounter has to mean something far heavier, far more loaded than just physical contact between two human hands.
The text demands an elevated reading. If you assume Jesus is simply saying, my body is currently off limits to human hands, you immediately crash into the scriptural evidence of Thomas and the women in Matthew.
The fathers recognized that the restriction was not about the physical capacity of the resurrected body.
What was it about then?
It was about the specific disposition, the intellectual and spiritual framework of the person reaching out. The prohibition is tailor-made for Mary Magdalene's specific internal state in that exact moment.
Okay, so to solve the puzzle, we have to figure out what was happening in Mary's understanding. And this brings us directly into the mind of St. Augustine.
Yes, he dives into this extensively in his tractate CXXY on the Gospel of John and his various sermons.
Augustine essentially sets up a twofold explanation. I want to unpack the first one, which is an allegorical reading, before we get into his second, more philosophical point.
Let's do it.
So, Augustine suggests that in this moment, Mary symbolizes the Church of the Gentiles.
Augustine frequently reads scriptural narratives on multiple levels simultaneously. In this allegorical framework, he posits that Mary represents the broader Gentile world.
But why?
Because the Gentile world would not come to believe in Christ until after he had ascended to God the Father. The Jewish followers, the disciples, believed while he was physically present on earth.
But the vast multitude of the Gentiles would only reach out to him in faith after he was exalted in heaven.
Yeah, so the command, touch me not, for I am not yet ascended, becomes a prophetic symbol of the Gentile church's future faith. He is essentially saying, the demographic you represent will not truly grasp me until I am reigning from heaven.
That is the allegorical layer. It demonstrates how Augustine views the text as a living, prophetic document that speaks to the unfolding history of the church.
But while that is a fascinating historical perspective, Augustine does not stop there.
No, he goes much deeper. This is where he introduces a concept that completely redefines the scene. He introduces the distinction between the carnal touch and the spiritual touch.
And to follow Augustine here, you must understand how he uses the word carnal.
Because in modern parlance, carnal usually carries a scandalous or purely sexual connotation.
Yeah, and Augustine does not mean it that way at all. For him, a carnal understanding is one that is bound entirely by the limitations of earthly physical perception.
It is an understanding limited to carbon, to meat, to what the physical senses can measure.
He points out that Mary was standing at the tomb weeping over Jesus, purely as a man. Her grief was the very real but very earthly grief one has for a human teacher, a human friend, whose physical, biological life has ended.
She is looking for a corpse. We see this in the preceding verses. She says to the angels, and then to the person she thinks is the gardener, they have taken away my Lord, and I know not where they have laid him.
She is operating entirely on the physical plane.
She wants to find a dead human body to anoint with spices.
Her belief in that moment, according to Augustine, was entirely carnal. She recognized the beloved human figure when he spoke her name, but she did not yet perceive the divine reality standing before her.
She had not yet progressed to the dogmatic knowledge that he is co-equal with God the Father.
And Augustine unpacks the command, touch me, not by paraphrasing the internal logic of Jesus this way. He says, believe not thus on me, according to thy present notions. For how could it be otherwise than carnally that she still believed on him whom she was weeping over as a man?
Believe not thus on me, according to thy present notions. That is a brilliant translation of the underlying concept. It shifts the entire definition of the word touch from a physical grasp to a profound intellectual and spiritual recognition.
It really does.
Let me try an analogy here to see if we can solidify how Augustine is viewing this. Imagine you are handed a profoundly complex, life-altering piece of philosophical literature.
Okay.
But instead of absorbing the philosophy, wrestling with the deep truths, and comprehending the actual message of the text, you use a red pen to simply check the spelling and the grammar.
Oh, wow.
You are handling the book, you are seeing the words on the page, but you aren't actually making contact with the author's mind.
I will push back on that analogy slightly, because while checking grammar implies a superficial reading, Augustine is pointing to something even more fundamental regarding salvation.
Okay, how so?
It is not just about missing the deeper intellectual point. It is about missing the nature of the object entirely. A better way to frame it might be treating a priceless, life-saving medicine as if it were just a glass of water to quench your immediate thirst.
Oh, I see.
You are ingesting it, but you are completely blind to its actual power to cure the fatal disease. Mary was reaching for a human rabbi to soothe her immediate grief, completely blind to the fact that she was standing before the creator of the universe who had just defeated death.
That makes the stakes much higher. If you stay on that level, you're missing the cure. And Augustine makes a staggering point in his sermons about the danger of this carnal touch.
He does.
He argues that reaching only the flesh of Christ without recognizing his divinity is no greater an act than what his executioners did.
The specific quote from Augustine's sermons is chilling in its logic. He asks his congregation, "What great matter is it to reach only unto that which the persecutors reached unto who crucified him?" The Roman soldiers touched him. They grabbed his arms. They nailed him to a piece of wood. A physical touch, devoid of spiritual recognition, means nothing in the economy of salvation.
The soldiers touched the physical body of Jesus more intimately than anyone, driving iron through his flesh, and yet they were infinitely distant from him.
Because their touch was purely carnal. To touch Christ rightly, Augustine argues, is to spiritually acknowledge his Godhead. It is an act of the mind and the soul ascending to recognize his true nature.
So when Jesus says, "I am not yet ascended to my Father," Augustine reads this as Jesus telling Mary, "You cannot truly touch me, you cannot truly comprehend me until your understanding ascends to recognize my equality with God."
You are trying to hold a man on earth. You must reach for God in heaven.
The physical holding back is a mandate for spiritual elevation. Mary's current framework is simply too small to contain the reality of the resurrection.
If Jesus simply allows her to cling to his physical form in that garden, he allows her to remain in a truncated, incomplete faith.
He refuses the lesser physical touch to demand the greater spiritual one.
And this philosophical foundation that Augustine lays down flows seamlessly into how Pope St. Leo the Great looked at this passage a few decades later.
Yeah, Leo the Great builds directly on Augustine's framework of the carnal versus the spiritual touch. But he puts a very specific, almost pastoral emphasis on the pedagogical aspect of this moment.
He views it as a masterclass in the elevation of the believer.
Leo the Great takes the concept of the spiritual touch and frames it as an act of deliberate divine preparation. He looks at the encounter not as a prohibition, but as a promise.
Listen to how Leo articulates the voice of Christ in this moment. He writes, "I would not have you come to me as to a human body, nor yet recognize me by fleshly perceptions. I put thee off for higher things. I prepare greater things for thee."
I put thee off for higher things. Just hearing that phrase completely changes the tone of the encounter.
It really does.
When we first read, "Do not hold on to me," it sounds like a harsh rejection, a stiff arming of a grieving woman. But Leo reads it as a delay with a promise.
However, this still feels incredibly counterintuitive to how we experience love and connection.
Yeah, because if you love someone, if you have deeply missed them, physical presence is the ultimate goal. You want them physically near. You want to hold them.
Human logic dictates that physical proximity equals intimacy.
And that human logic is exactly what Leo the Great is challenging. Human logic relies on physical geography. If you are in the same room as me, we are close. But Leo's text reveals that in relation to God, true proximity is not a matter of physical geography.
It is a matter of spiritual capacity.
So if Mary had embraced the physical body of Jesus in the garden while still viewing him merely as a restored human rabbi, she would have been physically touching him, but spiritually she would have been miles away from him.
Because she would be embracing an incomplete, diminished idea of who he is. She would be holding on to a memory of the past rather than the reality of the present.
The delay, the putting off that Leo describes, is the very mechanism that creates the space for her faith to expand.
Leo continues by explaining that once Jesus has ascended to God the Father, then Mary will be able to handle him more perfectly and truly.
The paradox here is astonishing. By removing his physical earthly presence from her grasp, Jesus makes a more perfect, true, and complete communion possible.
It requires a massive paradigm shift for you, the listener, to grasp this because we are so heavily bound by our senses.
If we can see it, if we can touch it, it is real to us. But Leo is saying the physical touch was actively hindering Mary from grasping the greater reality.
It forces a profound question about the nature of seeking God. Are we seeking a comforting physical presence tailored to our earthly understanding, something we can manage and comprehend easily?
Or are we willing to be put off so that we might be prepared for the overwhelming reality of the divine nature?
Leo shows us that Jesus' command was an act of profound pedagogical love. A lesser teacher would have accepted the physical embrace to comfort her.
But the true teacher refused it to elevate her.
And that idea of moving away from a lesser earthly understanding brings us to St. John Chrysostom.
Now, Chrysostom is always incredibly rigorous with a text. He was known as the Golden Mouths for his preaching, but his analytical skills were sharp.
Very sharp. In his homily LXXC6 on John, he tackles this scene from a slightly different angle, focusing heavily on the internal will and behavior of Mary as described in the text.
First of all, Chrysostom does some housekeeping. He explicitly rejects an idea that was floating around in his time, and actually propagated by some other writers, that Mary was reaching out to Jesus to ask for the Holy Spirit.
Chrysostom dismisses that theory entirely. He sticks to a rigorous reading of her behavior strictly as presented in the text of John's Gospel.
He notes that Mary had not been present for the extensive discourses in the upper room about the coming of the Comforter, the Holy Spirit.
Therefore, she could not be asking for something she had not been instructed about. Instead of looking for hidden theological petitions, he looks at her immediate, visceral reaction.
He observes that Mary wished still to converse with him as before. This is such a human observation.
It is. She wanted everything to go back to the way it was before the crucifixion.
The trauma of Friday was over. The teacher was back on Sunday morning. Let's resume our earthly ministry. Let's walk the dusty roads of Galilee again.
Chrysostom notes that in her immense, overwhelming joy, she perceived nothing great in him, although he had become far more excellent in the flesh.
She wanted to resume the old familiar companionship. She wanted the comfort of the known.
But Jesus says, "Touch me not," to deliberately break that earthly mindset.
Chrysostom uses a very specific phrase to describe what Jesus is trying to cultivate. He writes that Jesus wanted her to speak to him with much awe.
Much awe.
I want to pause on this word awe because it is critical. Does this mean Chrysostom thinks the old familiar relationship between Jesus and his followers is dead? Is he now just this distant, terrifying, untouchable monarch?
If we read Chrysostom's text closely, we see it is not that the relationship is dead, but that it must be radically transfigured. Earthly familiarity is no longer sufficient. It must become reverent awe.
Familiarity is a dangerous thing in the realm of faith.
It breeds a kind of spiritual blindness. We think we know something or someone so well that we stop truly looking at them.
Mary thought she knew Jesus. She knew the cadence of his voice. She knew his face. She knew his mannerisms.
But she did not yet know the resurrected Lord of Glory. Chrysostom highlights that this command was the necessary shock to break her out of the familiar and open her eyes to the reality of God.
And Chrysostom points out the incredible tact of Jesus in delivering this shock. The way Jesus speaks here is not a rebuke.
Chrysostom is masterful in analyzing the rhetoric of Christ here. He notes that Jesus could have said, "Approach me not as ye did before, for matters are not in the same state."
But Chrysostom argues that such a statement would have been harsh, high-sounding, and deeply hurtful to a grieving woman.
Instead, Jesus gently deflects her by stating a simple objective fact: "I am not yet ascended."
By pointing to his impending ascension to God the Father, he gently raises her thoughts away from the dirt of the garden, away from the familiarity of their past, up to his divine exaltation.
He gives her a theological fact to chew on rather than a personal rejection to suffer.
He doesn't crush her joy, he redirects it. Think about the difference between being thrilled to see a friend who survived a terrible ordeal and falling to your knees in awe because the person standing in front of you has literally conquered the mechanics of death itself and is co-equal with the Creator.
The casual familiarity has to be stripped away so the awe can take root. The transition is from relief to worship.
So far, we have Augustine telling us to move from carnal to spiritual understanding. We have Leo telling us we are being pedagogically prepared for higher things. We have Chrysostom telling us to trade earthly familiarity for reverent awe.
All of these are profound, deeply personal readings of the text.
But then we hit St. Gregory of Nyssa, and the tone of the deep dive shifts dramatically into heavy, high-stakes dogmatic theology.
It is a massive shift.
Gregory takes this very intimate, emotional garden encounter and uses it as a weapon in a massive theological war that was raging in the 4th century.
The shift in tone with Gregory of Nyssa is striking. In his dogmatic treatises, Gregory is not writing a pastoral sermon. He is defending Orthodox Christian belief against a highly organized group called the Eunomian heretics.
We need to spend some time explaining who the Eunomians were, because their arguments are the exact reason Gregory focuses so intensely on this passage.
The Eunomians were essentially an extreme offshoot of Arianism. They taught that the Son of God was unequal to God the Father.
They believed he was a created being, a secondary god of sorts. And crucially, they believed that his nature was subject to limits, boundaries, and physical changes.
And this is where the garden encounter becomes theological ammunition. The Eunomians actually weaponized this verse, "Touch me not, for I am not yet ascended to my Father," to prove their heretical point.
Wait, how did they do that?
They argued using the spatial physics of the ancient world. They pointed to the text and said, look, Jesus says he has not yet ascended. He is talking about physically traveling from point A here on earth to point B up in heaven.
Okay, I follow.
They argued that if Jesus is subject to local physical change, if he has to move through space to get to God the Father, then he cannot be the omnipresent, uncircumscribed God.
Let's define uncircumscribed for a moment, because that is a heavy philosophical term.
Yeah, let's break it down.
Circumscribed means drawing a line around something. It has a boundary, a limit. A physical body is circumscribed. You are sitting in a chair. You are not in the next room. You have limits.
The Orthodox Christian belief is that God is uncircumscribed. God has no boundaries. God does not need to travel from point A to point B because God already permeates all reality.
So the Eunomians read the text and say, Jesus is traveling. He is telling Mary not to touch him because he hasn't made the trip to heaven yet. Therefore, he is limited. Therefore, he is not fully God. He is a created, degraded being.
They use this text to try and tear down the core of the Christian faith,
Which forces Gregory of Nyssa to mount a rigorous surgical defense of the text by delineating the two natures of Christ, the divine and the human, which are united in one person.
This is the doctrine of the hypostatic union. Gregory asks a very pointed, brilliant question of his opponents. He asks whether they consider attributes like ascending, being seen, and being recognized by touch to be proper to the divine nature or to the human nature.
Because if you concede to the Eunomians that the Godhead itself, the uncreated divine nature, is capable of being touched by physical hands or has to move through spatial coordinates, you are dragging the Creator down to the level of the created.
You destroy the very definition of God.
Gregory dismantles their argument by carefully parsing the text based on the two natures. He argues that the command, touch me not, and the statement, I am not yet ascended, were spoken strictly by the moving, visible, and tangible nature which is proper to humanity.
The human body of Jesus, the human nature he assumed in the incarnation, is what changes location. It is what can be touched or not touched.
But the divinity remains untouched by these limitations.
The text from Gregory explicitly states the divinity remains uncircumscribed, intangible, and fills all things.
He writes that motion cannot be affected by that which already extends through all and is in all.
Therefore, the spatial movement of ascending and the physical prohibition of touch belongs exclusively to the human nature, while the divine nature remains everywhere present, unmoving because it is already everywhere.
I have to admit, when I first read this, I felt a strong urge to push back against Gregory's approach.
It is a lot to process.
It almost seems like he is taking this incredibly beautiful, intimate narrative of a grieving woman finding her lost lord in a garden and reducing it to a cold mathematical equation.
I see what you mean.
He takes a moment of profound human emotion and turns it into abstract, high-level metaphysics. Does he lose the heart of the story by focusing so much on dissecting the two natures?
It is a valid tension to feel when reading Gregory, but Gregory would argue, and the theological stakes of his era prove this, that properly defining this moment protects the very nature of God and the reality of the incarnation from being completely distorted.
Because if you allow the literalists and the heretics to read this passage purely on the surface level, as a story about a limited, created being moving from earth to heaven, you lose the true identity of Christ.
For Gregory, ensuring that we understand the difference between the tangible human nature that speaks the words in the garden and the intangible divine nature that fills the universe is not a distraction from the story. It is the only way to save the story.
It protects the absolute majesty of God. If the Eunomians win the argument, then Mary is just talking to a very powerful but ultimately limited created being, the entire Christian claim collapses.
By fiercely defending the two natures, Gregory ensures that when Mary's understanding finally does ascend, as Augustine and Leo desired, it ascends to the true, uncreated God.
The abstract theology is a fortress built to protect the intimate reality of salvation.
And Gregory makes one final, crucial point on this text that ties it back to Mary. He says it was not the intangible, invisible God that gave the command, but the visible nature proper to humanity that commanded Mary to go and minister the word to his disciples.
The human Jesus speaks to the human Mary, setting the stage for the ultimate revelation of the divine reality.
Which provides the perfect, solid bridge to bring this entire historical analysis forward into the modern era with Pope Benedict XVI, Joseph Ratzinger.
In his book, Jesus of Nazareth, Holy Week, Benedict takes all of these ancient, complex threads we have discussed. Augustine's spiritual touch, Leo's pedagogical delay, Chrysostom's awe and Gregory's defense of the two natures.
And he weaves them into a breathtaking modern synthesis. He develops what he calls the concept of new accessibility.
Benedict approaches the text with an eye for the profound paradox it presents. He highlights this paradox perhaps more sharply than any of the ancient writers.
He points out the basic human math. Mary wants to hold Jesus now while he is still here on earth before he ascends and is gone.
But Jesus reverses the math entirely. He says essentially, you cannot hold me until I ascend.
It is the ultimate reversal of logic. The human brain thinks, hold on to him tightly while he is still standing in the garden, because once he goes to heaven, he is gone forever. Physical presence is temporary. Catch it while you can.
But Benedict explains that the old manner of human companionship, the days of walking the roads of Galilee and sitting at a physical table, is permanently over.
He connects the encounter in the garden directly to the theology of St. Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 16, where Paul writes, "Even though we once regarded Christ according to the flesh, we regard him thus no longer."
That phase of the historical dispensation is finished.
And this is where Benedict's explanation of the Ascension becomes utterly vital to understanding the touch me not command, because we usually think of the Ascension the way the Eunomians did, as a physical journey.
We picture Jesus launching into the sky like an astronaut going into orbit, moving from point A on Earth to point B in the clouds. We think of it as spatial distance.
Benedict completely dismantles that simplistic view. He defines the Ascension not as a departure into the sky, but as an entrance into God's dominion over space.
Dominion over space. That is a massive concept.
Because Jesus, in his Ascension, enters completely into communion with God the Father, he is not absent from the world, rather he becomes universally accessible.
Think about the limitations of a physical body. If Jesus had remained physically on earth, localized in a physical body in Jerusalem or Galilee, he would only be accessible to the few people standing immediately around him in that specific geographic coordinate.
He would be trapped in time and space.
Let me bring back an analogy we touched on earlier, but let's expand it because it perfectly illustrates Benedict's point.
Yep.
Think about a physical meeting. If you and I are having a one-on-one conversation in a closed physical room, the only way someone else can interact with us is to physically travel to our city, find our building, open the door, and walk into the room. We are hyper-localized.
Mary, in the garden, wanted to keep Jesus in that closed room. She wanted the localized, physical, exclusive relationship.
She wanted to retain the geographic coordinates of their friendship.
But the Ascension is like moving from that closed physical room to a universal broadcast. Except in this case, the broadcast is an actual spiritual communion that permeates the entire universe.
Because Jesus goes to the Father, who is everywhere, Jesus is no longer bound by the coordinates of the room in Jerusalem. He is everywhere.
However, the broadcast analogy, while helpful for understanding omnipresence, has a flaw that Benedict would likely point out. A radio broadcast is passive. You just turn it on and it washes over you. Benedict's theology demands an active, participatory communion.
That is a fair correction. How does Benedict frame the reception of this new presence?
He states, from now on, we can touch Jesus only with the Father. This new accessibility requires a radical change on the part of the believer. Benedict writes that there must be a newness on our part as well.
You cannot tune into this universal active communion using the old carnal receiver that Mary was trying to use in the garden. You must elevate your understanding.
You have to upgrade your spiritual hardware to receive the new reality, which perfectly echoes everything the early fathers were saying.
It echoes Augustine's demand for a spiritual touch. It echoes Chrysostom's demand for awe. It proves that the refusal in the garden was not a rejection at all.
It was the initiation of a completely new way of being with God. Benedict emphasizes that through communion with the Father, Jesus is close to us in a new, limitless way.
The prohibition touch me not was the necessary breaking of the old, localized mold so that the new, universal presence of Christ could be realized in the lives of all believers across time and space.
The refusal of the physical touch was the prerequisite for the Church to experience him everywhere, not just in a garden in Judea.
It is astonishing how a single sentence, a few cryptic words spoken to one grieving woman at the dawn of a Sunday morning, contains the entire blueprint for the newly established relationship between humanity and God.
Let's trace the massive narrative arc of what we have explored in this deep dive. We started with a prohibition that seemed confusing, inconsistent with the other gospel accounts, and even harsh on the surface.
Why deny Mary the simple physical comfort she so desperately wanted?
But by refusing to rely on modern psychological guesswork and instead looking over the shoulders of the Church Fathers and Pope Benedict, we discovered that this prohibition was actually a profound theological invitation.
We saw through Augustine and Leo the Great that it was a call to move away from a carnal, purely physical understanding of Jesus and to ascend to a spiritual recognition of his absolute equality with God the Father. It was an act of divine preparation.
We saw through Chrysostom that it was a demand to trade earthly, comfortable familiarity for reverent, transformative awe.
We saw through the rigorous dogmatic theology of Gregory of Nyssa that the command illuminated the dual natures of Christ, protecting the truth of the Incarnation from heretics who sought to reduce God to a mere physical, limited phenomenon.
And finally, through Benedict XVI, we saw the unveiling of a new, universal accessibility. Jesus had to ascend. He had to leave the limitations of the garden so that he could be truly touched by all people in all times through God the Father.
It transforms a moment of apparent distance and rejection into the very foundation of universal intimacy. The text resolves its own contradiction beautifully.
It really does.
As we wrap up this deep dive into the garden, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought drawn exclusively from the source material. It builds on everything we've just discussed about the Ascension, but it adds a dimension we haven't fully explored yet.
It comes from a brief commentary by the early 3rd century theologian Origen, which was included in our texts.
Origen writes about the destination of this ascension that delayed Mary's touch. He notes that when Christ eventually ascends to the Father, he comes loaded with victory and with trophies, referring to his physical body which has conquered and risen from the dead.
And Origen points out that as Christ ascends through the heavens, certain unseen cosmic powers look at him and ask in astonishment, "Who is this that cometh?"
I want you to ponder this as we conclude. If Mary's attempt to hold Jesus in the garden was delayed specifically so he could complete this victorious ascent, what does this imply about the unseen cosmic triumph occurring in that exact moment? It suggests a triumph on a scale far beyond a simple quiet reunion in a garden, a cosmic triumph over death and spiritual powers, which Mary, standing there weeping in the morning light, was simply not yet equipped to perceive.